Morning. It is great to see you all here. I want to thank the organizers very much for inviting me today to join you. This is really exciting to be here. And it's exciting for me because this year's ADSA annual meeting is themed Keeping Humans in the Loop. And that's why I'm so glad to be here and be a part of this conversation. My work for the past 2 decades has largely been about how we put people right at the center of our global debate about technology's role in society and how we govern it. But keeping people in the loop can feel pretty abstract. So what do we actually mean by that? I want to start us off today with one example, and I also want to emphasize this is just one example. There are a lot of ways to keep humans in the loop. So in October of 2022, the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy released an extraordinary document, the Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. So what was it? It wasn't a regulation. OSTP is not a government regulator, and it wasn't law, right? It didn't have any legal force yet. What it was a statement of principle. In a world where AI is increasingly prevalent, it articulated these 5 rights that all Americans should have when encountering technology in their daily lives. So when we look at them now, and this is now 2 years later, they seem pretty obvious, right? Like, of course the AI system should be safe and effective. Of course we should be protected from algorithmic discrimination. Surely in the United States, we can assume that our data is going to be kept private. Surely if an AI system makes a judgment against us, we can challenge that. We can call it a human to help us get to resolution and redress. But in fact, not all of these are protected in law. And where they are protected in law, the law is not being enforced. And yet, as I think all of you who are here very near, data-centric technologies, algorithmic systems, AI, are not a new thing. We have been living with them for a long time. So something is amiss in our efforts to keep people in the loop. It's very easy to forget about people in the story of technology, to be consumed by the cycles of hype and fear about what technology alone can achieve or can risk on humanity. It's easier to embrace the story that a new technology will end poverty, cure cancer, fix racism, halt the climate emergency, than it is to center the complex and messy role of human actions and the impacts of technology on people. So governance, like the AI Bill of Rights proposes, is one way that we can keep people in the loop. The best technology policies that we can aspire to will consider the impact of technology on people and on communities as a central driving factor in what we value and what we prioritize. But we can't govern well, we can't make good policy without a strong understanding of that relationship between technology and society, that relationship between technology and people. And our understanding of that relationship hasn't been static, not at all. It's changed and evolved dramatically over the past 25 years as we've built a field that starts to ask those questions about what is really happening in that relationship. And that research that's happened in this field has really shifted how we think about what it means to keep humans in the loop and how we think about the different roles of the stakeholders, the companies, the researchers, the governments, and the individuals and communities that are all part of this big equation. So the story of how we got to where we are now is essentially a story about our attempts as a society to learn how we live with digital technologies. So my hope is that all of you leave here today with a few insights, hopefully. How did we get to this moment in living with data and AI? How can we put humans in the loop with these technologies in ways that are safe, that protect their rights, and that open rather than foreclose opportunities? And what do policy and research and practice of data science have to do with all of that? So I'm going to start with a little bit of context. So first, I'm the Executive Director of Data and Society. Data and Society is an independent nonprofit research and policy institute. We were founded in 2014 by Dana Boyd, who is a social scientist and a groundbreaking scholar of technology and society. And we actually just celebrated our 10th anniversary. This picture is very recent, it's from a couple of weeks ago. We had our 10th anniversary celebration and got our entire staff together in one place for the first time since the pandemic. So it was really exciting. So this is almost everybody. We're an organization of close to 50 people. And what we do is that we study the societal impacts of data-centric technologies and automation, and we use what we learn to shape policy. And our policy focus has been on the federal government's push over the past 4 years to figure out how to govern AI. The Bill of Rights that I showed is an example of where we've been involved in policymaking with our research. But the research that we're doing in Data and Society is primarily qualitative and field-based. We ask questions about the lived experience of people and communities when they encounter technology. And often that means that we're asking questions about power. What kinds of power and agency do people have when they encounter technology? What kinds of power and agency do they want? So let me tell a short story about power and agency to give you an example of what I'm talking about. So when Uber launched, so now this is like 2012, they recruited drivers and they kept regulators at bay by talking about driver freedom. Their recruiting materials cast Uber drivers as entrepreneurs. And so one of our early researchers in Data and Society, Alex Rosenblatt, asked this very simple question. Do Uber drivers feel like entrepreneurs? Do they feel like they have that kind of agency that entrepreneurship would suggest? And so Alice began this 4-year study of Uber drivers across the United States. Literally, she wrote around in Ubers all across the United States, hung out in chat groups and all kinds of things. And she ultimately wrote this book, Uberland, How Algorithms Are Rewriting the Rules of Work. So what she found in her research and in speaking with Uber drivers was complicated and fascinating, and there wasn't a single story. There wasn't a single answer to that question. Do Uber drivers feel like entrepreneurs? But what she was able to conclude is that practically speaking, Uber drivers are not entrepreneurs. Despite the lack of a human manager telling them what to do, Uber drivers were being algorithmically managed via the app on their phone. And so that insight about algorithmic management and the power dynamic that makes visible between drivers and company has major implications for how Uber is required to treat drivers and what the government expects of Uber as an employer. So what happened after, this is skipped many years in the middle, in January of 2024, the Department of Labor ruled that Uber drivers had been misclassified for years as independent contractors. And that therefore, drivers and a number of other gig workers in some situations had to be treated as employees, meaning that they were due the kinds of protections that employees have, like paid overtime, minimum wage, and other standard labor protections. The ability to organize. That's power. So DNAD Society's research centers people who are in the margins of technology debates. Uber drivers is one example. We've also researched union labor, home health care providers, and Medicare recipients, essential warehouse workers during the pandemic, teenagers, increasingly disenfranchised communities who are living in the shadow of rapidly expanding data centers. We're interested in understanding the often invisible humans in the loop and how technology is impacting them in positive and in negative and sometimes completely unexpected ways. So methodologically, how we work is we use a socio-technical lens in our research. So what that means is that we view technology and society together as a coherent system. And we see them as not really understandable as separate systems. So our researchers start from the stance that a technology's real-world performance, safety, and broader impact is always going to be a product of technical design and broader societal forces, organizational bureaucracy, human labor, social and cultural norms, and power. And so socio-technical research is also usually, necessarily, interdisciplinary and collaborative. So we need to be able to do it, the perspectives and the expertise of people from across disciplines, social sciences, the computer data sciences, biological sciences, humanities, legal scholarship is critical. So I'm going to tell you a story about one of the classic studies in recent socio-technical research to give you a sense of exactly what I'm talking about. A few years ago, my colleagues at Data and Society, Madeline Ellis, who is an anthropologist, and Elizabeth Watkins, who is a communications scholar, teamed up with doctors at Duke University Medical Center to study the rollout of a system called Sepsis Watch. Sepsis Watch was an AI sepsis detection system that was being rolled out in the emergency room at Duke University Medical Center. So rather than studying the technical abilities, how well did it detect sepsis, what this team studied was the effects of introducing an automated system into a specialized clinical care environment. They wanted to understand the challenges of putting an AI system into this highly structured workflow, highly structured environment, how it would change the communication flows between patients and nurses and doctors, what existing power dynamics might be disrupted and then need to be reordered, and what the implications of that were on clinical care decisions in life-threatening situations. So what they found is that the integration of Sepsis Watch into the emergency room broke existing social structures and expectations. There were information flow, power hierarchies between doctors and nurses, and that had to be repaired through human labor. And that labor was performed primarily by female nurses. And then the technology could work as its designers intended. So in their paper, Repairing Innovation, Ellis and Watkins argue that innovation is not only needed to develop new technologies, but also to integrate those technologies into existing social structures. And that work of social integration of technical systems is usually invisible. So that's the kind of socio-technical research that I think should inform policy making and practice because it puts people right at the center. Without that socio-technical lens that tells us how the technology is impacting real people, policymakers and employers, companies can't design rules for how we use AI and other technologies in safety and rights respecting ways. So let me tell you a little bit about why I'm the one telling this story and how I fit into it. So, remember this? Now I'm really going to date myself. So I graduated from college. I'm just going to grab and I can see you all. Okay, I'm not like one of the owners here. I graduated from college in the mid-1990s into these two extraordinary moments of global change. So one of them was the arrival of the commercial internet, the World Wide Web, and it was this period of unbounded optimism about what technology could do for our society. But there was little thought at that point that these new technologies might have complicated impacts on people, or that they themselves might need to have guardrails to put around them. In fact, in 1996, some of you will recognize this, in 1996, John Perry Barlow, who was the founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, published his very, very impactful manifesto, a declaration of the independence of cyberspace. And he basically said, governments, stay out of our internet. You have no sovereignty where we gather. And that idea stuck for a very long time. So the second extraordinary moment of change in the 1990s was a political one. What the American political scientist Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. Yeah, some of you remember this. So his assertion was that at the end of the 50-year Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, it pointed to, and I'm quoting here, an end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western, that is American, liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Okay. So anyone breathing today will know that that didn't quite work out that way. We can look back from the vantage point of 2024 and we can recognize that that view was overly triumphant, and it turned out it was not correct. We do not today live in a world, unfortunately, of liberal, peaceful democracies, and the development of political thought did not end in 1993. But at the time, Fukuyama's idea was an incredibly powerful one, and it deeply influenced not only Western political thought, but it deeply influenced how the United States and other Western democracies showed up around the world. And those two narratives of the 1990s, this power of ungoverned technology to create wholly positive changes in society, and the inevitability of US-style democracy overtaking the rest of the world, set these very broad expectations about what the future would look like and the role that technology would play in that future. So my own path married these two moments. In the second half of the 1990s, I moved to Central Europe, which was emerging from decades of Soviet influence, to join a technology startup movement that was fueled by a group of American investors that was investing in the region in Central and Eastern Europe and in Russia. So I was there because I wanted to, experience these expected political changes in real time, and I wanted to work on this new thing called the internet. And it was a very, very exciting time, very, very optimistic. And then in the early 2000s, I was living in Hungary, which had this small tech startup community. But Hungary was also a hub for this whole group of international development organizations that were focused on supporting the new democracies emerging in the region. And many of these pro-democracy organizations were interested in how these new data-centric and information technologies could be used to support and to expand democracy-building efforts around the world. And I was also interested in that question. So in 2002, I jumped out of the commercial startup space and into this new field that was emerging in technology and democracy. And then for the next decade and a half, I worked at that intersection of technology, of governance, and human rights and accountability. I was at the Open Society Foundations, which is an international philanthropic organization. And then in 2016, I moved to Data and Society, where I continued my work in this field. I was then in a new research organization. But the field that I entered in 2002 was very, very different from where we are now. So what's changed? So I'm going to take you on a very quick sweep through the history of technology and society. So the first decade of the 2000s, some of us remember that, saw so much new technology come online from innovative new companies. That's when we got Gmail, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. They all launched in that first decade, and we also saw things like WordPress and other blogging platforms that were giving people tools to circumvent gatekeepers, to share their thoughts with the world. We saw new collaborative projects that were making use of the internet's distributed capacity, like Wikipedia or like Global Voices Online, both of which are great organizations which are still around. And at that time, this very powerful idea took hold that the decentralized design of the internet, combined with people spontaneously coming together online, led to new kinds of political power. We saw books like Howard Reinfeld's Smart Moms, The Next Social Revolution, and Clay Shirky's book, Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations. And they both captured this sense of dynamic optimism, the idea that new platform technologies, when harnessed by groups of people, inevitably led to positive and pro-democratic ends. It was this big wave of tech for good. And in this version of technology and society, the heroes were the technology and these decentralized groups of people. And the villains, if there were villains, were governments who might seek to constrain or silence online actors. And the companies behind these technologies were the good guys. They were providing platforms that enabled human connection, free expression, and pro-democracy movements to flourish. And there still really wasn't much thought about the cost of that. So beginning in 2010, the Arab Spring uprisings took place, part of a series of so-called Twitter revolutions. This is a picture of Tahrir Square in central Cairo in 2011. And what we saw were thousands of young people who were organizing and mobilizing online, occupying the common squares of Arab capitals. They were demanding change that they deserved, removal of corrupt officials, an independent judiciary, more economic opportunity, free and fair elections. And many of the observers of this believed that given the power of these new tools to turn people out, massive crowds, that the protesters would prevail. So in 2013, Professor Zeynep Tufekci was on the front lines of pro-democracy protests in Turkey. In Twitter and Tear Gas, the power and fragility of network protests, she writes about the ways in which social media fueled protesters' ability to organize quickly and to create these powerful signals in opposition to authoritarian governments. But she also writes about the pro-democracy hype around social media's role in political change. She points to the protest movements that ultimately failed, because although they brought people into the streets, in many cases, they could not support the sustainable movements. They couldn't support the leaders that ultimately would lead to durable change. And we also saw counteraction. Repressive governments brought the inevitable countermeasures to bear, both in online ways. Sometimes they just shut off the internet entirely, or they circulated misinformation. They surveilled protesters through their own devices, but also offline, because this was happening in the real world. So you saw violent suppression protests, jailing of pro-democracy figures. So as the young organizers of the Arab Spring ended up in jail, and worse, those cracks in the narrative of technology's inevitably positive force in society, the idea that technology would radically change long-standing political and economic power dynamics, were starting to become more visible. Also in 2013, Edward Snowden shared his revelations with the world about widespread secret government digital surveillance programs aimed at US citizens. So some saw Snowden as a traitor, some saw him as a hero. Regardless, it was a bombshell. And the revelations validated long-standing fears of civil liberties organizations who had warned that our increasingly pervasive digital infrastructure allowed not only the kinds of human connections that we all love on Facebook, but a network of government surveillance to grow unchecked. In different hands, the same technology could have radically different impacts, and it remained largely outside the reach of existing and applied law. So Data and Society marched to 2014 into this moment of growing unease and uncertainty about technology, and our proposition was that we needed a new body of evidence. We needed grounded, empirical, interdisciplinary research that would help us to understand and ultimately govern how technology and society were interacting that centered people. So a field of researchers and investigative journalists and new organizations started to come together during that period to answer that call for robust socio-technical evidence about what was really happening in technology and society. So we saw interdisciplinary scholarship that pointed to the discriminatory effects of systems built on, as we called it then, big data. We saw investigative journalism that showed the ways in which algorithmic systems used in courtroom risk assessments were biased against Black people. We saw groundbreaking computer science showing similar biases in facial recognition technology. We saw disenfranchised communities who were seeking government support, encountering opaque algorithmic systems that deepened poverty and inequality. We saw evidence that new systems of algorithmic management were dehumanizing work in increasingly automated settings, like care work that required electronic surveillance in order to get paid. We saw deep sociological research that showed that Google's search engine, built on biased data sets, regularly returned sexist and racist information, cloaked in the neutrality of technology. So these studies I'm showing are just a tiny fraction of the work that a field studying technology and society have produced over the past 10-ish years. And because of this field of work, it's no longer a fringe idea that data-centric technologies have real impacts on society, that those impacts can be harmful, they can be racialized, and they can fall disproportionately on marginalized groups. But as this drumbeat grew, we also saw a strange unwillingness from government to govern, to make new rules and use existing law in order to protect people from the harms of algorithmic technologies and AI that impact their rights and their safety and their opportunities. So in 2018, the Cambridge Analytica scandal broke. What the Snowden revelations in 2013 did in terms of exposing government surveillance, the Cambridge Analytica scandal showed the world the dangers of corporate surveillance through social media. And suddenly people realized how much of their data was being collected by companies like Facebook and Twitter with very few legal protections in place. There were almost no limits on collecting or sharing or selling data, and it could be used to target or manipulate people for all kinds of purposes, including political. And even more concerning as we move into an AI-driven world, personal data is being used to train massive AI systems without any of those safeguards in place. So in response to Cambridge Analytica, Congress summoned Mark Zuckerberg and other tech CEOs to Washington to explain themselves, and many of us expected to see protective legislation follow minimally comprehensive federal data privacy protections, which we do not have in the United States. But Congress didn't do that. No laws were passed, no protections were enacted. And then the same thing happened again in 2023 as the world grappled with a similar reckoning following the launch of ChatGPT. History repeated itself. Lawmakers were again summoned to Washington to come tell us what's happening. Sam Altman, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg was there again. And again, nothing happened. But what we have seen for years are commitments from the tech industry to pursue self-regulation in response to concerns about the harms of AI and data-centric technologies. My ethics statement, this is the Meta Oversight Board, other kinds of public commitments. And so while this kind of recognition of harms from the private sector is a positive step, it's something that we want to see, these commitments haven't substantially moved the needle in ensuring that enforceable protections are in place. The value of regulations, of laws, is just that. They are a requirement. And so regardless of how well-intentioned companies may be, their monetary commitments have always been that, voluntary. Fundamentally, tech companies and venture capitalists who back them don't want to be regulated in ways that hurt their bottom line. That is understandable if you're running a company. And they wield tremendous power in Washington. This is partly because of the fear that without unfettered innovation from tech companies, the United States will lose geopolitical dominance in competitions with China and with other countries. But it's also because AI companies and venture capitalists spend increasing millions on lobbying lawmakers to hold back regulation. I wasn't able to get a slide that has the 2024 spend, but it is a lot more. And so that really leads us back to these protections that are laid out in the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights and why they are so critical to our goal of keeping people in the loop. These are the kinds of protections that can shift power meaningfully towards people. So we've come a long way from John Henry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, telling governments to stay out of the internet's way. And we've learned how seriously technology can impact people, both in good ways, but also in harmful ways. So because of this, we need some basic agreements about the ways that technology can be developed and used and deployed in the world. So the Biden administration has enacted some of these ideas in the AI Bill of Rights a year later, a year ago right now. They put out the executive order on AI that directed a whole of government approach to governing AI. And it included the requirement for government agencies to test and evaluate AI systems to meet basic safety and rights protections before they are put into use. It also requires consultation with the impacted communities. So these are remarkable steps given what we're coming out of. It is a complete departure from the past 20 years. But the executive order only governs the federal government's own use of AI. And the government is a big user of technology, so it's a critical bar to set. But to impact the wider world, to impact the private sector's development and deployment of AI, we need federal and state laws to be brought to bear. And the stakes are high. The decision to leave data-centric technologies ungoverned is also a decision to allow an assault on many people's rights and freedom and opportunities. We can make choices instead that empower people. And by making different choices, we can also create other opportunities to keep humans in the loop. Governance can shape our innovation environment towards people and towards the public interest. Many worry that regulating AI will mean foreclosing development and stifling innovation. But in fact, as we've seen in other areas, from drug development to electric vehicles, the best kinds of market shaping regulation create incentives to build towards shared societal goals like clean transportation, powerful medicines, a safer environment for all. So where do we go from here? So I want to propose 3 ideas that I think would shift our current technology and society ecosystem towards one where people are centered and have real power. First, regulation and law. We have laws on the books that apply to emerging technologies. We have civil rights laws, we have civil liberties laws, we have workers' rights laws. These all should be applied in the digital sphere as well as in the physical one, but they're not. And that's because we lack 2 pieces right now. We lack capacity for enforcement, and we lack research. We lack socio-technical research to help us understand how to interpret existing laws in the context of algorithmic systems. For example, what does algorithmic discrimination look like in the context of education or public housing or Medicaid distribution? Congress should also pass new laws to protect people's rights, starting with strong federal data privacy protections. And since data is the foundation of AI, privacy safeguards are crucial early on to protect people later. A second piece that I think we need is meaningful participation. So this is really a critical complementary project to regulation and law. It means that we need to ensure that individuals and communities participate in deciding how AI is used in their lives and how it is not. So participation, if done well, can be a proxy for power and agency. So I mentioned the executive order's requirement to consult communities in assessing AI systems. Federal agencies are going even further than that. So last week, for instance, the Department of Labor issued principles and best practices for artificial intelligence and worker well-being. And the first principle of this document is worker voice. So it says, I'm going to read it specifically, it says, workers and their representatives, especially those from underserved communities, should be informed of and have genuine input into the design, development, testing, training, use, and oversight of AI systems in the workplace. So this version of participation is a huge leap forward in how we think about technology and people and power dynamics. But what's challenging is that we don't really have robust methodologies for participation. It's one thing to say that communities should be involved in how technology comes into their lives, but it's quite another to have a set of practices and approaches so that participation is meaningful, is not extractive, and genuinely gives communities more power in decision-making, rather than participation theater, which is often what can happen. So in Data and Society, we're working on this through something called the Algorithmic Impact Methods Lab, or the AIM Lab. So algorithmic impact assessments, which are similar to environmental impact assessments, look at how AI systems affect people, which can really only be done in a participatory way. So our team is partnering with communities and developers to create a kind of gold standard for doing these assessments with people at the center. And our goal is to see this methodology adopted widely in both government and industry. So the last thing I want to talk about is AI in the public interest. Right now, the AI field is dominated by a narrow corporate agenda. We badly need a robust ecosystem for AI research and innovations and applications that support public interest goals. And the government has started to play a role in building an AI ecosystem for the public interest. One example is the National AI Research Resource, or also called the NAIR, which is the federal government's program to scale up access to compute and data and infrastructure for academic research in AI. So access to compute is a great first step, but the government could be doing much more than investing in tech infrastructure. We should also be expecting a full-throated commitment to a vision for public AI, systems that prioritize public rather than commercial needs, participatory development, and the protection of rights and safety. And to act on this, we would need to see investment in supporting and sustaining the human infrastructures of AI. The computer and social scientists who are working for non-commercial public interest outcomes, the participation of communities, the tech policy community developing policy to ensure that in the future humans are fully in the loop. So we need to see the field of AI research and development not only as technical but socio-technical if we're to truly realize the promise and the optimism about technology and society that I started from. So this is where I'm going to leave you all today. As data scientists, you are in a position to shape the fundamentals of how we use technology in society. How can we make the practice of data science more socio-technical, more participatory, more grounded in people and communities? How can the practice of data science shift power towards people? So I hope each of you will leave here thinking about a collaboration that you would want to build, a community that's important to you in your work, the people that you hope to serve. I hope that for those of you who may be looking for the next step in your career, that you will consider data science for the public interest. You could start by looking at the federal government's AI talent search, which is an effort mandated by the executive order on AI to bring many more skilled people into the federal government to work on AI innovation and governance. You can make choices about what you work on. And so my ask today is that you do that with people as your North Star. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Janet. It looks like we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. And if you want to ask a question, wait till the microphone comes to you. All right.
Hi, Janet. My name is Jared Draghi, and I'm a Dean Hines Mathematics level major at Indiana University. So let's actually go up to data ethics. I really loved your work down in regards to what we should be looking at in regards to the keynote you look for. My question we have is that a lot of times when I'm talking to people in regards to AI, it's a lot of times the enthusiasm to be able to make products with people in line. How do you go about starting those conversations so that people kind of understand how they're pursuing their products or their innovations with people moving forward?
So I'm a policy nerd, so rather than a data scientist. So my starting point is usually the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, because it did the work of kind of condensing down why do we need to be thinking about people and essentially what happens when we don't. I don't think that the right answer is to say, we shouldn't have innovation, we shouldn't have technology. That's not the answer. The answer is that in a world where technology is totally ungoverned, we end up with a lot of preventable harms. And we also end up with with a set of products that are driven by a commercial agenda rather than a public interest agenda. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's where I would start.
Other questions?
Thank you so much. It was a very insightful presentation. I am Subhashri Sengupta from Florida State University. My question would be, one of a very foundational pillar of educating or, regulating power and sort of empowering people is through literacy. And literacy is a facet that touches into all the points that you mentioned, be it policy and regulation, meaningful participation, and just the whole ecosystem. So what should be our perspective towards literacy? Because now we have silos, we have technical education, we have critical education, we have different paradigms of education and AI existing in various silos. So if we were to adapt this socio-technical framework and sort of also, pivot our stance on literacy for AI, what should we be thinking of? Thank you, that's my question.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think literacy is really critical. I will say that I think there tends to be in some sectors, I'm not saying this is what you're saying, the idea that literacy will encourage people to use AI more, essentially. Like if only people understood it, then they would use it more. And my guess is that it might be the opposite, given our current environment. And so I think that being clear about what the goal of literacy and education is really critical. I think it's probably, in terms of how I would think about it, I think that training people to have, or educating people, and I think this starts early, to have a critical understanding of AI and the data-centric technologies is so important. That and I think that there's actually a great book that isn't in my presentation, but that I would so recommend it as a starting point that just came out called AI Snake Oil. It's by Arvind Narayanan and Sayed Kapoor at Princeton. And it's a sort of explication of what AI can do and what it really can't do. And what it might be able to do in the future and what it probably will never be able to do. And it's written in a way that I think is very accessible to a layperson reader. Most people are just going to go out and buy a whole book and read it, but I think that can be a useful place to draw on and helping people to understand really that question of what can the technology do for you and what can it not at this point? How is it safe to use and how is it really not safe to use? What can you trust and what can you not trust? I think those are important ways to frame literacy efforts.
But more time for questions. I will note that Janet left a list of resources in the shared folder, so take a look there too.
Hi, Janet. Thanks very much for sharing. I'm Chris Brooks here at the University of Michigan. So something I genuinely struggle with, and I've watched Data in Society over the years and really appreciate the human-centric nature of everything you guys are doing. But something I've really struggled with is government as the regulator and government as, if you will, the gold standard of our ethics, morality, and integration. I guess I'm saying this a week away from an election, which is going to be consequential, whatever it is. But I also look at things like the FDA, and I look at how slow it takes drugs to come to market. I look at the pharmaceutical industry and how only the biggest players can play. And I actually feel a lot of the AI regulation push is frankly going to help the big players. The smaller players, the startups, even those of us in academia who are using AI, don't have the size of budgets to do or even comprehend, frankly, hundreds of pages of regulation. And so then often these regulators chop out sections and they're like, if you're this small or if you're open weights, then you don't have to conform. But that doesn't strike me as reasonable if we actually care about what those safeguards are. So I guess, can you help me understand why government is an appropriate place for us to be focusing energies in order to make AI better for society in the future?
Yeah, thank you. I also struggle with that question. And I think to your point, not all governments are going to be good regulators, right? Not all governments are going to be good actors. Different governments will prioritize different concerns, 100%. And governments will regulate badly, for sure. So, I mean, I think in answer to your question about like why, for instance, as I understand the question, why am I focused on government regulation? I mean, the answer is because I've spent 25 years in this field, and probably the first, 18 of them was a lot of wheel spinning of like sitting down with, Facebook's policy group and talking through, and, that doesn't work. Those are voluntary commitments. And I think there's, if we think about the field of like, how do we create change, it is, there's practice, and practice in, professional communities is incredibly important. There's industry behavior, and that is also incredibly important, but again, is unregulated. And then there's the ability to bring some bright lines, some hard accountability. And so, I mean, my background broadly is in governance. And I think that question that you're pointing to, how do you balance soft accountability and hard accountability, is, it's always going to be a question of where we balance. But right now, we are so out of whack on the hard accountability side, even at the most fundamental levels. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough how bizarre it is in the international community that the United States does not have federal data privacy protections. 137 other countries do. Okay, we don't. So I think there's a sort of corrective moment that's happening right now, and the Biden administration really got out in front of it for a bunch of different reasons, which we can talk about. But they decided to really prioritize that because they saw that AI was coming down the pipe. They saw what was going to be happening, and they got a lot done in a short period of time. Will the next administration? I don't know. It may be that the next administration is just really focused on implementing those pieces. And is Congress going to pass laws? Like, I don't think they should worry about that, honestly.
My question was, I'm Margit Burmeister, I'm from University of Michigan, Bioinformatics, Computational Medicine Department. My question is sort of along the same line as Chris's, and maybe put it a little bit more provocative. What we have done right now with no government regulation is basically given censorship rights to companies. I mean, Twitter was super powerful in promoting Trump and then stopped Trump and now is promoting him again under different ownership. These people have so much more power than any kind of government regulation can have. And I mean, we complain about I go to China a lot. They have the famous firewall, and the government is absolutely regulating free speech there. But I mean, I've been blocked half a dozen times out of Facebook for saying something negative about Hamas as a terrorist organization. We have delegated this idea of censorship now to to big corporations. Wouldn't it be better to just, have Telegram style, everyone can say what they want and do what they want? So can you maybe comment on that?
So, this would be an interesting conversation because we, to some extent, disagree on the role of government here, but what I will say is the story that I told was about sort of one line of like how we might think about power. Another line is essentially the economic power model, right? So that's what we're seeing the FTC do. That's what Lena Khan is trying to do, and the DOJ, to try to, through antitrust, anti-monopoly work, to try to reduce the power of tech companies. And so, I mean, to your point, should we just have like completely free speech? I mean, I would argue, the book that I would point to is a book by Mary Anne Franks called The Cult of the Constitution. And what she argues in that book is that the sort of wholesale, unfettered application of the First Amendment means that people who have less power in society can speak less. And I think that we have seen this, right? Like, I don't think that you see many left-leaning female politicians doing any kind of campaigning using X. And the reason for that is because they are shouted off the platform. And so that's what, in the context of where we are right now, I think that totally ungoverned, no content moderation, social media gets us. And I don't think, I mean, that's not an outcome that I think is a good one. But I think, the point you're raising is right. We don't have a perfect solution to this, and so we're always going back and forth. I personally think that the work that the FTC is doing is really, really important. I also don't think that the breaking up of monopolies is going to solve the problem that you're talking about.
I apologize I got here a little bit late, but my professional experience has been healthcare IT, and I bring that up to say is that in healthcare, there was a big incentive to get providers to implement electronic medical records. I bring that up to say, from your perspective, in my view, behavior change for companies and individuals comes to carrots or sticks, wherever it comes from, government or anything else. From your perspective, should we focus on the carrot approach, the stick approach, or do you have a third option that you would see as probably effective?
I think we probably need both. I will say, this was also not the subject of my talk, but I mean, in terms of the third way, I would say that I don't think that right now, this wheel broadly, that is a field that is looking to bring more governance to the broadly AI area, has any political power. We just don't. Companies have a lot of political power. We have built a really, really good field that observes the problem and that explains the problem to policymakers. That is really different than having the political power to push for real change. And so if there's a third way, I would say it's built political power. But I think both carrots and sticks are important.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. I am also coming so late, but I have a question for you regards the regulation. So some regulation takes so many years to occur, and even like something like FDA occurs because some accident like thalidomide, and many of this happen because we still need an accident that happen, and if this accident not occur, and what has this media and marketing like in thalidomide, this even regulation will not occur. Did you see that we will have in some time ability that generative AI can catch those incidents automatically and can generate a regulation? And what can make this happen, and what can prevent this from happening?
Thank you. So, sorry, just to understand, your question was, can we use generative AI to design regulation more quickly?
Yes, so basically just catching the incident, any incidents happen, and try generative AI to update the regulation from time to time. My question is that, can this happen, and what will make this not happen? What will prevent this from happening?
So this isn't necessarily my area of expertise. I can say a couple of things. So one is that I think within in systems where you're looking for compliance, essentially for sort of no quantity issues or challenges of regulation. So for instance, computational bias, right? Then there are more automated ways to catch that. There are companies in the kind of ethical AI business space that are, designing and selling products that do just that. I don't know whether they're generative AI or not, but there are some computational approaches to that. But I think to sort of to the point of one of the core points of what I was talking about, I think that if we don't have socio-technical research, if we don't have a way to understand in a very grounding, field-based way how technologies are affecting people and communities, we can't really expect generative AI to know what to look for. So I would say maybe it was the future, but right now we really lack the evidence base that would allow a system to sort of automatically be able to identify those.
Great, I think we have time for one more brief question.
Thank you so much. My name is Pearl, and I'm a student at Columbia University majoring in computer science. And I'm so excited to be here because recently I discovered that I really enjoy working with data. And that excitement just wants to, tell others, have other people be more excited about working with data. And recently started a chapter 2. However, I liked the idea of thinking about the collaborations that we want to form. Do you have any advice on how to approach that, especially with established organizations? Sometimes it can feel like an island. If you're a student, send out a couple of emails trying to build that connection and you never hear back from people. So I would want to know if you have any suggestions on.
Yeah, absolutely. So in New York City, actually, there's an organization. There are a couple of organizations that we have been touched about, but there's one called DataKind, which is an organization that works with data scientists and data science students and connects them with nonprofit organizations that are looking to solve data science problems. So that's one. Another organization in the space of New York is called All Tech is Human. And they have fairly regular meetups and kind of do book launches and stuff, and it's a great place to get on a mailing list and sort of, you can just go and meet people and talk to them. Data and Society sometimes does events in New York City, so sign up for a newsletter. Yeah, those are two that are kind of regularly doing that work of building connections. But it is challenging. It is very challenging.
This is wonderful. Thank you, Janet. And another round of applause, folks, for Janet.